Hi guys, welcome to our webinar on how to teach pronunciation. My name is Valentina and I've been working as a teacher for 8 full years, been a part of the Skyeng team for over 2. Last April, I joined the premium team and I've also recently joined TTC. I love English, I love teaching it, and I sure love being a part of such a great team of professionals. During this webinar, we're going to see why we should teach pronunciation, why it's important, or what things to pay attention to, or what things exactly to teach, how we should do it, and how we shouldn't, the right way of doing it, and we're also definitely going to have a look at pronunciation teaching activities and some sample lesson plans. Of course, when we talk about teaching pronunciation, one of the biggest and often controversial questions is why to do it. Of course, a lot of learners want to try and aim at the so-called native speaker-like pronunciation. And a lot of them think that this is the ultimate point of learning English. So is it? Of course not. It is not exactly true. Pronunciation has traditionally been taught with this goal of speaking like a native speaker, but it is not practical at all. In fact, it is a recipe for discouragement for both teachers and students, and this has even been referred to as a perfection trap by Morley, 1992. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. We all have our own speaker and learner peculiarities and abilities, and achieving that native speaker-like sound in most cases is either completely unnecessary or sometimes even downright impossible. A more practical approach, and what we should really be aiming at, is acquiring the so-called listener-friendly pronunciation, so that our listeners just won't need to make efforts to understand us. And we will also need to improve listening comprehension, decoding sounds, which is a part of pronunciation, and sound combinations. And we need to identify attitudes and intentions. Both of these things bring us to two important points: pronunciation for better production and pronunciation for better reception. Let's keep it in mind that learning pronunciation for practical purposes can have a positive influence on your students' motivation, self-esteem, confidence, attitude to languages, etc. Why can this process be so difficult? Here you can pause the video for a bit and think of some reasons for that. And I'm pretty sure that here are some of the ideas you've had. You can see that the more differences there are between the native and the target language, the more effort it will take from both teachers and students to get closer to the appropriate target language sound. Also, of course, the less exposure to the real language the student has, the more difficult it will be for them to get used to the sounds of the target language and to become more confident in producing them. Then, attitudes, of course. A lot of people think that native speakers sound weird. The others, on the opposite, want to sound exactly like the former. Another one is that some learners want to work on their pronunciations and some don't. Also, we are all different based on how well we differentiate between the sounds when we hear them and try to produce them. Well, after you've decided to teach your student pronunciation, you will definitely question yourself which model to choose to teach. Well, there is no easy answer here. You will need to teach that model of English that your student is aiming at. You can target production and reception independently. If your student needs to understand a variety of accents or any specific one, say they work with a company which has a lot of different nationalities, people from different countries, then you will want to aim at reception more, exposing your student to more variants of the same pronunciation features. If you're working on production, the best way is to teach what you know and use and help the student be easily comprehended by a variety of people. And I just want you to remember that basically we cannot teach accents if we're not specifically trained for that. Moreover, we're just not going to teach such specifics. We can only teach pronunciation, and the best way here is to choose the most universal and the most widely spread model. Another big question, of course, is which exact things to teach. Here, I can't help mentioning that before you start teaching pronunciation, it is important to understand that there are different features of pronunciation. Just as well as you cannot teach grammar without deep understanding of all the rules and uses, meaning that you cannot teach present perfect if you don't understand what it is about and how we can use it. It is impossible to teach pronunciation if you don't know its different features and you don't know the difference between them. All the features can be divided into segmental ones and suprasegmental ones. Segmental features refer to separate segments, which are voiced, unvoiced consonants, short and long vowels, and diphthongs. Suprasegmental features explain how individual sounds behave when they are joined together, such things as weak forms, elision, assimilation, catenation, intrusion, and so on. During the webinar or the workshop, we are not going to focus on different features of pronunciation. We're only going to focus on the ways to teach them. So if you feel that you don't know enough about these features, we strongly recommend just to start with the TTC pronunciation bot and refer to some sources and books, which I've got right here, that you can go to if you feel you need better understanding of the different features of pronunciation. And after you've done so, you're welcome to get back to the webinar. And now we're going to have a look at how not to teach pronunciation and what not to do. There are three major problems when we deal with pronunciation. What are they? First of all, it still tends to suffer from neglect, unfortunately, but mostly not due to teachers' lack of interest in the subject, but most often due to a feeling of doubt as to how to teach it. And when it's not neglected, it is usually very reactive rather than strategically planned. And even if it is planned, it is usually taught through either drilling or long explanations about how sounds work, or it is just isolated from the rest of the class, not connected with the main topic. So what should we avoid doing if we want to teach pronunciation? It is not a great idea to do some work on isolated sounds or rhythm or intonation or anything else like that out of any context. All the sounds you're teaching, all the features you're teaching have to be intertwined with the context of the class. For instance, giving isolated tongue twisters or rhymes, just as well as explaining how to pronounce something without further practice, without including it into the class, is just not a great idea. And then our next question, of course, is how to teach pronunciation. Just as well as with everything else, it is a good idea to maintain some balance. And by balance here, we mean that there should be some reactive or unplanned pronunciation practice in response to your students' errors. And there must be some proactive or planned pronunciation teaching in any course you're following. Before we move to some specific exercises that can help you teach your students pronunciation, we're going to have a look at how we can actually include teaching pronunciation in our lessons. And there are actually 3 ways of doing that. We have integrated lessons, remedial lessons, and practice ones. As you can see, integrated lessons are lessons in which pronunciation features are analyzed during the language focus stage when studying new grammar or vocabulary. So you will have one main topic of the whole lesson. It can be grammar or vocabulary or something else. And you analyze pronunciation features during every stage. Let's have a look at it in this sample lesson plan. Just as usual, you start with a warm-up, some small talk, stating lesson aims. Then you set the context. It can be reading, listening, situation, picture, or anything like that. You highlight new lexis or grammar in the context. You analyze meaning, form, and pronunciation, which is normally referred to as MFP, of new lexis and grammar. It can be, for instance, the weak forms of have in the third conditional, would have, should have, and so on. Then you have some controlled practice of those MFP. You have some freer practice. And of course, you wrap up with some cool down and giving the feedback to the student. The next way to integrate pronunciation is remedial lessons. And this is a type which is actually hard to steer clear of. And I'm pretty sure you've all had them in some shape or another. It is a class where you deal with pronunciation difficulties just by mistakes correction and some quick explanations. And here is an example of a. Again, you start with some warm-up, small talk, lesson aims, just as always. And then this is followed by the main body of the lesson, all the main activities that you've planned, which are just added by your corrections. And then you wrap it up with cool down, discussing the results, pointing out all the good and bad moments from it, giving the feedback. And then the third one, which has probably the biggest focus for the new pronunciation features than the previous two, because in this case, specific pronunciation features form the main focus of the lesson. Let's have a look at how it works. Just as usual, you start with a warm-up, you set the context, which will most likely be listening or video in this case, since you need the actual authentic sound. Don't forget how we organize our work with audio and video as well. Then you will highlight the new features of pronunciation from the context. Analyze these new features of pronunciation with your student. Then there comes controlled practice with new features of pronunciation in listening and speaking. Then it's practice time. And of course, you wrap it up with some cool down. Now that we've discussed the possible types and plans of the lessons, it is time for us to have a look at some pronunciation receptive and productive teaching activities, which can all be incorporated in previously mentioned lesson plans. And let's start with the receptive ones. When we talk about pronunciation, of course, we all remember how important stress and intonation are in English. So one of the activities that you can successfully use during your class is practicing marking stress when working with new words, especially before extensive listening or speaking practice. What we do here is that we prepare some intonation patterns to match with the new words for our students, just what you can see on the slide. This activity is suitable for teaching word stress, phrase stress, intonation patterns, and it will also help your students to connect the words in the sentences with how they're actually pronounced and see the intonation patterns and stress. Another reception activity is working on some target pronunciation features. And here the student will work with a transcript of the text, and they will have to mark the target pronunciation features such as weak forms, intonation patterns, other features of connected speech, and so on. This activity perfectly suits for teaching connected speech features, weak forms, intonation, signposting, and intonation and rhythm, you name it. You can incorporate it into your practice lessons and introduce the new feature of pronunciation and do some controlled practice with that, of course. As another task to boost the effectiveness, you can ask your student to record themselves when speaking and analyze their use of connected speech features, intonation, and that will help them compare themselves with the target pattern and will make production later easier. Another great receptive activity is scripting. Before listening to a text, give your student the script. They work with it and predict what pronunciation features will be prominent. Then together with your student, you check the predictions against the audio while listening to it. And as you can see on the slide, this activity is suitable for teaching any pronunciation feature, and it is greatly suitable for integrated and practice lessons when you will need to set the context before analyzing MPF, and also, of course, while you're having controlled practice. When we talk about productive pronunciation activities, we've got a variety of them as well, but one of the most common is probably drilling. Everyone's done that. Drilling, though, can be different too. In general, it is a repetitive oral practice of a target language structure. So it can present itself as repetition or imitation. That is when a teacher says a model and a student repeats it. Just as easy as that. The teacher says, the sugar is on the top shelf. And the student repeats, the sugar is on the top shelf. Another way to use drilling is substitution drills, when a teacher says a model and a suggestion for replacement. So the sugar is on the top shelf, and then the teacher says, bottom. The student says, the sugar is on the bottom shelf. And then the teacher says, middle. And the student says, the sugar is on the middle shelf. And there can also be other variations, like repeating with different intonation, different emotions, and so on. This, again, can be suitable for teaching words in isolation or connected speech. You can incorporate them into at least 2 types of lessons. For integrative pronunciation practice, you can use it after analyzing the meaning of the new vocabulary or grammar structure, and for remedial pronunciation practice, where you can just correct the mistakes during the mistakes correction stage. Another great productive pronunciation activity is chaining, which is a way of drilling when you break down a long or a difficult word into palatable parts, model, and have your student repeat it. There are 2 types of chains. There can be a front chain, when the sentence is drilled from the start, and a back chain, when the sentence is drilled from the end. You can see the examples on the slide. For the front chain, you say, if I'd, and you have your student repeat. And then you say, if I'd seen him, and your student repeats. And then you say, if I'd seen him, I would have. And then you say, would have. And then the whole thing, if I'd seen him, I would have told him. And your student repeats all of that. And you do the same for the back chain, but from the end. Told him, would have told him, I would have told him. And this activity suits for teaching the sounds and word combinations, connected speech, intonation, and into types of teaching pronunciation lessons, for integrated pronunciation practice and for remedial one. There is also another way to use marking activities like the ones that we had in the receptive pronunciation teaching stage for production. In this case, a teacher asks students to have a look at the script or the text and mark all the instances of specific features of pronunciation that will be or must be prominent. Students mark all the features, break them into speech units when possible or when necessary, and then read aloud. This activity can be suited for teaching any feature of connected speech or intonation. You can also use it in any type of lessons, which are integrated, remedial, or practice ones. But keep in mind the fact that it is difficult for learners to remember to use linkage in their speech. So without drawing their attention to pronunciation features, reading aloud will be useless for pronunciation practice. So we always need to pay explicit attention to those features if we want to make any productive activity effective. And finally, there is one more activity for productive pronunciation practice, which is quite entertaining and can also be very creative for your students due to this possibility to apply what they've learned to their own sentences. Let's have a look at shadowing and voiceovers. As for the voiceovers, you and your student work with a video, just as usual, with pre and while viewing tasks, and then you ask them to do a voiceover for a muted video. Lower level students can read the subtitles, higher level students can make their own comments up. And if we're doing shadowing, that will definitely also promote fluency. And the main principle of shadowing is quite simple. You listen to a piece of recording more than once first. Then you repeat the sentences, trying to sound as close to the speaker as possible. It is, again, suitable for teaching any feature of connected speech or intonation, and can be used in any types of class as freer communicative practice after the analysis and control practice with the target pronunciation feature. At this point, I'm pretty sure all of you have this biggest question. So we know the types of the possible lessons to build pronunciation practice at. We also know the types of activities, as well as have some examples of the activities. But how to plan the work on pronunciation, where to begin with? Well, of course, we will have to go through some questions to answer before we start planning anything. First, you decide what pronunciation feature your student needs to work on. Then you ask yourself, is it new for my student? If no, then it can just be a remedial lesson. As you remember, it is the one where you correct the mistakes during any stage of your lesson plan. If this feature is new for your students, we got two ways to go. It will either be an integrated lesson where you include reception activities into your lesson plan, or it will be a practice lesson where you will dedicate the whole class to pronunciation features and you will include both reception and production activities. This is all I wanted to share with you today. And now, your next steps are the following. First, please do the test under the video just to check how well you remember or understand everything. Then sign up for a practical workshop where we will practice planning pronunciation lessons and creating pronunciation activities. And then check your email after you signed up and join the Skype chat. Don't forget that if you haven't received the link up until the day of the workshop, please contact the expert on Skype. Thank you very much for your attention and see you at the workshop.